My name is Claire Shrewsbury and I'm the Associate Director of Culture and Development from HR Division. My colleague Emily Lawton and I are delighted to be hosting this first in a series of Women in Leadership seminars. The saying goes, save the best till last, but we don't believe in that, and certainly not with the year that we've had so far. So we're starting this series with two inspiring ANU leaders. No pressure. We very much want to thank the people who are joining us today who were involved in the design thinking workshops that we ran last year, which helped us get to this point. Your patience is finally being rewarded. Our panelists today are Naomi Flutter and the Honourable Julie Bishop. Naomi is a Pro-Chancellor, or the Chancellor's Deputy on the ANU Council, and Naomi has been Pro-Chancellor since 2017 and a member of the ANU Council since 2014. Naomi has personal connections with Canberra and the university, having grown up here and completed honours degrees in economic history and law at ANU. After completing her studies, Naomi worked for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Canberra and in refugee camps in Kenya and Nepal. In 1998, Naomi joined Deutsche Bank's investment banking business in Sydney, and in 2013, Naomi was appointed head of Deutsche Bank's Global Transaction Banking Division for Australia and New Zealand, and later became head of trust and agency services for Deutsche Bank across Asia and the Pacific. In August 2018, Naomi made the big move to WA, joining Wesfarmers Limited as Executive General Manager Corporate Affairs. Phew, a busy time. Julie was appointed as 13th Chancellor, lucky 13, of the Australian National University from the beginning of this year, and as you may know, is the first woman to hold the role. Julie served as Australia's Minister for Foreign Affairs from 2013 until 2018, and was the first female in that position, as well as the first female deputy leader of the Federal Liberal Party for 11 years from 2007 until 2018. In 2014, Julie led the international response to the downing of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 over Ukraine, and was awarded the Commander of the Order of Merit of the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Under Julie's leadership in 2017, the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper was developed, providing a comprehensive policy framework for the subsequent decade, and the New Colombo Plan was established, enabling Australian undergraduates to live, study and work in the Indo-Pacific region. Within 5 years, more than 40,000 students had participated in the plan. I think, Julie, you took a selfie and shook hands with many of them. As Foreign Minister, Julie defined gender equality and women's empowerment as a core priority in Australia's foreign policy, with a focus on economic empowerment and support for women leaders in our region. Notably, the Women's Leadership Initiative, launched in 2018, was a formal mentoring program where emerging female leaders from Pacific Island nations were paired with mentors from among experienced Australian leaders. In a political career spanning over 20 years, Julie also served as Minister for Education, Science and Training, Minister for Women's Issues and Minister for Ageing. And Julie's relationship with ANU goes back to her time as Education Minister in the Howard government, where she also established the $10 billion Education Endowment Fund to invest in higher education and research. We are very fortunate to have two such experienced and accomplished women leaders presiding over our ANU Council, and we thank them for making themselves available today to share insights on some of the issues facing women in leadership roles. And I'd now like to hand over to Naomi to begin. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire, very much, and thank you also, Emily, for your work together in pulling off this function, this initiative. It's great to participate here from Perth. Thank you too for your acknowledgement of country. The Chancellor and I, Julie and I, are here, as you've said, in Perth, and we're on the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I'd like to start, as we always do, by acknowledging and paying respects to elders past, present and emerging here as well. So 2020 has really been such a extraordinary and difficult year in so many respects for so many people, end to end, from Canberra to Perth, across our country, but particularly I think also for people at the ANU. If I think about the time that we, from a council standpoint, have spent focused on some of those challenges, The year began with a new Chancellor and bushfires and smoke in Canberra. We all know what's happened since then with the pandemic, and that's been cause for great concern, great focus for so many people around the council table and across the university. And I think, you know, certainly from a council standpoint, our thoughts have throughout been with all of the professional, academic staff, students and their extended families as they've dealt with those challenges that have come our way. Today, though, really is an opportunity to focus on something that is extraordinarily positive and different, less about challenge and more about sort of remarkable opportunity. And that all comes in the form, I think, as you said, lucky 13th and first female Chancellor for the ANU, such an extraordinary milestone. And Julie, a great opportunity to talk to you today and to try to tease out some of your thoughts about women and leadership. So I'd like to start, though, with that appointment. And, you know, it was my extraordinary honour to meet with you and talk to you in the lead up to our announcement of your appointment as Chancellor. What was it that attracted you to this role? Why did you say yes to being Chancellor of our university?
Well, I've learned that you're a very difficult person to say no to, an outstanding alumna of ANU. Well, Naomi, I had completed a 20-year political career, and that had been on top of a 20-year legal career. Don't do the maths. And I resigned as Foreign Minister, and I didn't contest the next election. And so I was looking for my third career. And I had in mind that I just wanted to pursue areas of great interest, areas that I had a real passion for. And one of them was education. I had been Education Minister in 2006, 2007, and absolutely loved the role and the potential that our higher education sector offered many Australians. And so I did have in mind that I would do something in the education sphere, and then when ANU offered me the opportunity to be Chancellor, I was honoured and privileged, of course, because it is such an important national institution in Australian life. But I also knew from my dealings with ANU that it was the higher education institution that had the most potential to be amongst the best in the world from Australia. And I have an ambition that ANU should be among the top 20 universities in the world. We're a top 20 economy, and I think it just goes hand in hand that we should have a top 20 in terms of rankings university, and that would be ANU. It was set up after the Second World War, as we all know, a research-intensive university. It's the only university set up under federal legislation. And so as a member of the federal parliament, I always took a particular interest in what ANU was able to do and able to achieve. Of course, I had great respect and have great respect for the Vice-Chancellor, Brian Schmidt, and so the relationship between Chancellor and Vice-Chancellor is very important. You as Pro-Chancellor and then others on the Council, I felt that I could work with such a dynamic group and really looked forward to it. So I accepted with great pride, and then on the day my chancellorship took effect, the 1st of January, Canberra recorded the haziest city in the world status, apparently, on that day due to our bushfires. Then the bushfires, dramatic bushfires occurred and we had to close the campus. Then that incredible hailstorm, we had to close the campus. And then COVID-19, and we closed the campus again. And I started to think, is it something about me, or have I just managed to become Chancellor at a most challenging time? But with all credit to the staff, the students, the ANU family, we are getting through this. And so the resilience of the university has really made me feel that I definitely made the right choice, the right decision in accepting the chancellorship. And I have to say, I was also delighted to think that I broke that cycle of male chancellors, and that after almost 75 years, ANU had its first female chancellor, and let's hope there are many more, just as there will be many more female pro-chancellors.
Can we talk a little bit about mentoring. And Claire mentioned this in the introduction, your involvement, your leadership in launching the Women's Leadership Initiative for women leaders across the Pacific, providing mentoring to them with Australian women leaders to help them advance. Can you, if you reflect on your 20 years in the law and 20 years in politics and your career post-politics, what role have mentors played for you in your career, and how did those relationships come about? How were they as impactful as they have been?
Sometimes I had people who acted as mentors in an informal sense, you know, friends or advisors whose judgment I trusted, people who were interested in my career advancement and not necessarily at, you know, their own, and so they had no agenda other than to give me good advice, particularly going through law, because when I practiced law back in the early days, I'm talking early days, I was an article clerk in 1979, but a person who was a role model rather than a mentor was Dame Roma Mitchell from Adelaide. She was the first female QC in Australia, the first female Supreme Court judge, the first female governor. I think she was the first female Chancellor of Adelaide University, but she was a towering figure in the legal circles in Adelaide when I was a young lawyer. And she always took time to talk to young female lawyers and tell them some of the pitfalls and the challenges, but to hang in there. And she was inspiring. Later in politics, it seemed to me that what was missing was the ability to attract more women into political life. And men just have a natural mentoring system. You know, they just naturally network, and the more of them there are in a group, obviously, the more mentoring and networking goes on. Because there were so few women in Parliament and so few women in senior roles, there tended to be a dearth of female mentors. Not that your mentor always has to be female, but I thought that what political parties needed was a mentoring system. Different political parties have done it to varying degrees of success. But when I became Foreign Minister, it was quite evident to me that the way we were going to bring greater peace and stability into the Pacific, which is essentially a responsibility of Australia in terms of development and aid and the like, was to empower the women. And they had fewer opportunities, fewer educational opportunities, fewer opportunities to be economically independent. And so few of them went into political life, yet I could see they needed more women in Parliament to get better outcomes. I mean, at one point, PNG, a parliament of 100 members, had no female parliamentarians at all. So I started a mentoring program where we would identify young women, usually who had won an Australia award, so they were doing studies in their university in the Pacific. They had spent time in Australia, and then they would go back to their Pacific Island nation and often would not get ahead. So I connected them with a business leader, a female business leader or political leader or NGO leader in Australia. And the formal or informal mentoring, I think, was of great assistance, because we now see more female leaders in the Pacific. So mentoring works, whether it's informal or formal, it absolutely works. And I remember as Education Minister, we did one of the universities did a control experiment. A group of senior women were mentored, another group were not. And at the end of 5 years, the evidence was overwhelming. The mentored group had more advancements, more promotions, more grants, greater job satisfaction, you name it, than those that were not mentored. Well, you must have had mentors too.
Without question, and from all sorts of different places in my career, from outside the organisations I've worked in, within the organisations. What you said about people being mentored from non-profits, from government, from the private sector resonates with me, definitely, yeah, 100%. You, in talking about, was it Dame Rosa? Dame Roma Mitchell in Adelaide. amazing, yes. One of the phrases that you used, Julie, was that she would encourage you to hang in there, to stay the course, which goes to this sort of theme around resilience, in a sense. Is that what mentorship provides you, a sense that you can keep batting on?
I think mentorship provides advice, support, but also it helps put things in perspective. So if you have somebody who you can go to for advice, who's been there and done that, or has more life experience than you, or if you're trying to be a politician and they've been in politics for a while, they've seen it and they can tell you this will happen or that will happen, but don't worry, have confidence in your judgment, have confidence in your perspective. Be yourself, be authentic. And often you need someone to remind you of that, particularly when things seem overwhelming or events have gone really badly. I mean, there are a number of times in Parliament when I thought, why don't I just stay in bed today and put the doona over my head and this will all go away? But if there's somebody in your life that says, no, you can do this, have confidence in your ability to get through this, and nothing is ever as good or as bad as it might seem at the time. So keep it all in perspective. And I think that's what mentors can do. And that then builds resilience.
Yeah.
You get through a really challenging situation and think, well, I survived that, I can keep going. As they say, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger.
So there's enormous responsibility, in a sense, when you're at the vanguard of this movement, because we still have such a long way to go to achieve, what I would describe as gender balance, in a sense. And you've certainly over the years been in many situations where you've been in a room full of men, and the only woman. I saw you interviewed by Andrew Denton shortly after you left politics, and you described the situation where you're sitting around a cabinet table, a room full of men, a table with only men at it, with your exception, and saying something, and it just sort of passes through to the keeper, and then someone else says the same thing shortly thereafter, and how you assert your right to be heard, in a sense.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, and I don't mean to criticise men in any way. It's just that I've experienced it time and time again, and so have other women. I would be sitting at a cabinet table of 20 members, and I was the only female. This is 2013, and I was the only woman in the executive of government. But anyway, so I would, as deputy leader, I would speak fairly early on in the discussions, and I would say something, or always try to put forward a thoughtful contribution or whatever. And there'd be a silence, nobody would comment, and then it would go around the room, and then somebody would pick up precisely what I'd said and come up with the same idea. And people go, yeah, that's a good idea, why don't we do that? And I'd be sitting there thinking, didn't I say, wasn't that what I said? Did they not hear me? But it's an experience that other women have related to me. I first heard about it in a formal sense at a meeting of female foreign leaders in about 2012. I was in opposition then. And a number of women were talking about this gender deafness, how men just don't seem to hear you or acknowledge. They just relate to what other males say in the room. And I remember being in the US also during the Obama administration, and the women in the Obama White House felt the same way, and actually came up with a strategy where they would deliberately reinforce the view of the woman who had spoken, to the point where they were saying, would you just listen, XYZ has just made this point. You didn't hear it, acknowledge it. And so women started to reinforce it. And that we did that in cabinet after once more females were appointed to cabinet. I would go out of my way, if I obviously supported the concept or the idea, I would go out of my way to reinforce it, to back the women in, because their ideas were worth hearing and worth acknowledging.
So to fast forward to your role today, how do you, as you chaired a number of ANU council meetings now, and do from my observation, extraordinary an extraordinary job of engaging everyone around the table, of making sure that all of those perspectives on a problem, there have been a number of problems this year, as we've touched on, and seem to have a strategic focus on solving that problem with as much information, as many perspectives as we can possibly have. I think together, if we harness all of our knowledge, not just sort of a narrow segment of experience and knowledge and perspective, we'll do a better job of solving problems. Is that's another way of expressing that? Does that resonate with you?
Well, I had some very good advice early in my career, and that was whenever you're about to make a decision, gather as much evidence as you can, know the facts. And that saved me from many very difficult situations in my political career. Many people go out knowing half the story, and I tended to be much more cautious about getting the facts. Perhaps it's my legal training, getting the facts and then being able to make a reasoned decision or judgment based on what you perceive to be the facts. And I don't think that happens often enough. So in my role as Chancellor of ANU, I'm blessed to have some very talented council members and people who know a lot more about issues than I. And I think the best outcomes are when you have a diverse range of views around a table. And that goes for any decision-making forum, not just ANU's council, but the cabinet, boardrooms across Australia. A diversity of views. You can't have everybody just agreeing with the chair, yes, men or women. A diversity of views and people feeling confident to put forward their view and having it respected. Might not be accepted as the outcome or go towards the resolution, but people should feel free to express their views. And I think that's so important. And another reason why, you talk about, what did you call it, gender balance.
Yeah.
You absolutely need a diversity of voices in a room. And given our population is 51% female, well, it's a good idea to at least aim for that. So knowing the facts, harnessing evidence, and I also think that there are different leadership styles. I've certainly noticed that over many years. What I'd call a male leadership style is very different to a female leadership style. I'm not stereotyping. I'm not saying all women have these leadership qualities, but they are female qualities, much more collaborative, much more cooperative, looking for consensus, whereas male leadership attributes, much more adversarial, much more top-down, much more holding a team to account, whereas women leaders tend to focus on the individual and try and nurture the individual to grow the team. It's been, fascinating to apply that kind of thinking to leaders that I've met and worked with around the world.
What about uncertainty as well? Is there a difference in the way, do you think, that women leaders and male leaders perhaps, not absolutely, but perhaps in general, might grapple with uncertainty? Are they comfortable with uncertainty? Do they work to address or resolve uncertainty differently?
Interestingly, one thing that women are uncertain about is usually their own ability to achieve, and that is, I'm afraid, one of the barriers that hold women back, their lack of confidence, the lack of certainty that they will be able to achieve a particular job. And of course they can, and of course they should, but it's building that confidence. But I think women problem solve in a different way as well. I've certainly noticed, again, trying not to generalise, but I've noticed that women do tend to focus more on gathering the facts, working through an issue and being very confident of the, here's my thank you, here's my beautiful coffee. You didn't get
almond milk. No, I've already had a couple.
Yeah.
So,
but they tend to be much more cautious in coming to a conclusion. But that's not a bad thing, because too often people don't think through the consequences or even the secondary effect of their decisions. So I used to find this in cabinet, that people would be very quick to say, okay, this is the answer. And yet, as the great Thomas Sowell, the Stanford economist philosopher, used to say, before you make a decision, ask, what are the alternatives? What are the alternatives? what is the cost? And that's just not monetary, financial, reputational, what's the cost? What is the evidence? What is the actual evidence that you're basing your judgment or opinion on, or your decision that is most likely to give rise to the outcome you claim? And I used to add a fourth one: what could possibly go wrong? And I think if more people ask themselves those 4 questions, you might have some different decisions.
Can we talk a little bit about the new Colombo plan?
Can I drink my almond milk?
And you can have a sip of your almond milk cappuccino. That was obviously one of your passions, one of your signature initiatives as Foreign Minister. Cross-cultural capability, Asia literacy. Why do you think that is important? Why was that an area of focus, and why is this a great way to achieve it?
Well, I went to university in Australia, Adelaide University, and I don't recall there being any international students at all in my year at law school. I went overseas for the first time when I was about 18 with my sister, who was also at university, and we went through Asia, not quite backpacking, but we travelled through Asia, and I was just astounded at this whole world out there. I didn't study overseas until much later. I did one of those executive courses at Harvard Business School when I was about in my late 30s, and that experience of living and studying overseas was just transformative. And so when I was Education Minister, I was interested to see how many of our students, Australian students, would actually take the opportunity to live and study overseas. And we did a research paper and found that very few, and if they did, they tended to wait till their postgraduate years, and then it was invariably in Europe, England, United States. And I thought, well, that's not our region. And I was worried that the next generation of Australians weren't going to know enough about Australia's place in the world, not spend enough time or any time in the Indian Ocean, Asia Pacific. So I came up with this idea of a new Colombo plan. The old Colombo plan back in the 50s and 60s was bringing students from the Asia Pacific to Australia, and they'd study in our universities, live with an Australian family, and then they went back and were fantastic ambassadors for Australia. Some of them ended up as cabinet ministers or business leaders and the like. So I thought, let's reverse it. The government should support young Australian students in their undergraduate year, because that's the formative years, undergraduate years, to get an opportunity to study at a university in our region, live on campus or with a family or somewhere. But I also wanted them an opportunity to see the workplaces, to see how people not only lived but how they worked. Yeah. So it was quite ambitious, and we ended up having partnerships with 38 countries and Hong Kong and Taiwan in the Asia Pacific. We had relationships with universities throughout the Indian Ocean, Asia Pacific, and also with businesses and not-for-profits and governments who took our students on for work experience. Now, the feedback I've had from those who've been overseas has just been overwhelming. They say it has changed their life. Suddenly they know what they want to do. And I knew that in those undergraduate years, we often have students drop out or they don't actually find what they want to do. Being away from home, being overseas, looking at Australia through the eyes of others, or having the opportunity to work in a completely different environment, often focuses people's minds, and they come back far more confident, wonderful ambassadors for Australia, but with new perspectives, new ideas, sometimes a second language, and also networks and connections that I hope will last a lifetime for them. So I'm terribly proud of the new Colombo plan, and I just hope that governments forevermore continue to support the idea of young Australians broadening their horizons. And I have to tell you, one of the consequences of it was that it's turned into a very powerful soft power diplomacy tool. A number of leaders from our region gave speeches to a joint sitting of the Parliament when I was there. Xi Jinping, Prime Minister Abe, Prime Minister Lee of Singapore. And in their speeches to Parliament, all of them mentioned the new Colombo plan as an example of Australia's sophisticated engagement in the region. They were flattered that the Australian government would pay for our students to spend time in their countries and their universities. And that's not been a reputation Australia has had in that field before, because we've always expected students to come to our universities to study and gain one of our qualifications.
It also, I think, for me, and having watched it closely from the vantage point of the ANU, it has its focus firmly on the long-term benefits, on the horizon. Yeah. But it's activated in the here and now, in a sense.
That's right.
So it will play out over a very material time period as students graduate and then pursue careers.
So far, about 60,000 students have been involved in the New Colombo Plan. Some for 12 months or more. Some for who maybe they've gone to the Pacific Islands where there wasn't necessarily a university course available to them, so they've done more of a practicum. But 60,000 young people who have been exposed to a life beyond their own at a very early age. 18, 17 to 30, I think the age range is. But so many of them say it's really whetted their appetite, that they're now curious, they want to do more, they want to see more. They know that there's more to life than perhaps just getting a degree and getting a job and that's it. They really want to push themselves and test themselves. I think that's great.
And that curiosity creates greater cross-cultural competency, but possibly also greater capacity for men and women to work together as well.
I think that's right, and it's also seeing Australia through other eyes. It's had some rather interesting diplomatic impacts. There was a point where Australia and Indonesia were having a rather torrid time over some allegations of spying, if I recall, and we were having some very delicate negotiations, and the media back here in Australia was saying, that's the end of the Indonesia-Australia relationship. But all the time, Indonesia was still welcoming our New Colombo Plan students, and in fact, we had 2 students offered internships at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Indonesia at the very time when people are saying, the diplomatic relations are at all-time low. Indonesia could see the benefit of nurturing young Australians to have a greater understanding of Indonesia and working within those different cultures and working with different people and different perspectives, different outlooks. And, of course, when we talk about diversity, we don't just mean gender diversity.
Yeah, right. So we've spoken already a bit about mentoring. Role models play a different, have a different purpose, play a different role in women's leadership, I think. You must have met some extraordinary women leaders around the world. Are there some that have inspired you particularly? And if you could name them and share perhaps why they've been that inspirational.
Yes, I was fortunate to meet a number of extraordinary leaders, male and female, during my time as Foreign Minister. A couple of female leaders stand out. There were 2 US representatives in the UN during my time. First was Samantha Power. She was appointed by the Obama administration. She was feisty. I worked with her during the Security Council deliberations over MH17. And then the Trump administration appointed Nikki Haley, and she was also an incredibly dynamic person. They really dominated the UN Security Council, 2 very feisty women. I had an enormous respect for Angela Merkel. She came to Australia. I met her at a number of events, and she was, talk about resilience, she was amazing, having been brought up in the former East Germany, and I think she went to university with Putin or something, and she was a very determined leader. I had a lot of respect for Theresa May. She went through a terrible time as leader before she left the post, but I had a lot of respect for her. One of the more delightful but also strong women leaders was Federica Mogherini. She was the High Representative, or the equivalent of the Foreign Minister of the European Union. She was a relatively young Italian diplomat, and she found herself in some extremely tense meetings, but she always used her charm and poise and intellect to seemingly skate through it. I remember once being in a very tense foreign ministers meeting when Secretary of State John Kerry and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov were basically at each other's throats, fighting over Syria. It was a very verbal assault. They were slinging insults and it got quite tense. And Federica piped up. Federica and I were the only females at this meeting. Federica piped up, "Why don't you two just take your fight outside on the street?" And it just, it was so unexpected that it just, Russia and the United States were not used to being lectured like that, but it really broke the ice, and then everybody returned to a much more civil discussion.
So I've just jotted down some of the adjectives that you used to describe those women, and things like formidable, feisty, resilient, strong, which are very kind of compelling qualities for leadership. But you also weaved in things like charm and poise and humour and grace and intellect. So those role models, in a sense, are the kind of the full package. They bring that sort of strength required to navigate challenges, but perhaps some of the humanity to engage people, take them along.
What I did learn is that the most assertive person in the room is not necessarily the most effective. And I found that the great leaders, and I would suggest male should fit into this category, but the great female leaders had that combination of resilience and determination, but also a charm and accessibility. You know, that they were not so formidable that you didn't think you could approach them. They had an ability to relate and connect and engage and always maintain a sense of humour, which I found quite, even Angela Merkel would maintain a sense of humour at a pretty tense time, appropriately so, and I thought that is an ability worth having.
Yeah. We've got about 5 more minutes of questions from me, and then I know Claire is going to open up the chat line for questions from people who've joined this session and moderate those questions. But just a couple of final quick ones from me, if that's okay.
I was going to ask you more questions.
Oh, well,
we'll reverse this soon. One of the next speaker series, I'll ask you questions.
Yeah, right, okay. I want to ask about isolation, because often, the whole notion of leadership is regularly sort of framed as sitting atop, and in quite a sort of a solitary sense. There is a leader. We have a chancellor. We have a vice chancellor, for example. Have you ever found that leadership role as isolating, and how have you addressed that sort of sense of isolation?
I think it's inevitable to a degree that when you become the head of the team or you become the head of an organisation, there's a certain amount of isolation. But I always found that surrounding yourself with people who can give good advice or support is absolutely vital. You need technical advice, you need whatever the subject matter or the organisation or whatever it is that you're leading, you need technical advice from people who can tell you this is what's going on. You need people who have their ear to the ground and know what's happening in an organisation, the human interactions in an organisation, but you also need people who support you. And so I have always found in organisations where I've been a leader or in a leadership role, that maintaining connections with people in the organisation at all levels and being accessible but also reaching out and connecting takes away that sense of isolation. I think that we've all seen it in leaders who become increasingly isolated, and then they end up being just in a little bubble and they're either too scared to take on advice or they reject advice. I think that's one of the most destructive things for a leader. So I think maintaining connections, reaching out, and also having around you people who can provide you with the support and the advice that you need.
And just one final one before we go back to you, Claire, which is sort of for the benefit, if you like, of the broader group of people who are on this, and some advice to emerging women, or women who, you know, still have 20, 30 years of careers and sort of further leadership ambitions. Is there, I mean, you've talked a lot about kind of building confidence and that confidence being really key. Is there some advice as to how to cultivate those capabilities?
I think something I learned very early on, and it was certainly advice given to me, was don't let others define who you are and what you can achieve. Don't let others set standards for you that they themselves could not or would not meet. And I learned that the hard way a few times, where I would try to be what I thought others expected me to be, or I would assume that criticism was valid because it was coming from a particular source. But then when you sit back and say, no, I know my capability, I know what I can do, I have my own aspirations and ambitions, I'm not going to have somebody else define me, and I'm not going to have somebody else set a standard for me that they can't or won't set. I'll set my own standards and I'll work very hard to achieve them.
Fantastic. I mean, that message around sort of, in a sense, confidence, but also confidence through authenticity and self-awareness.
And it might be something,
very compelling.
Yeah, it might be something you have to do every morning when you're looking in the mirror. I won't let others define me. I'll set my standards and I'll meet them.
On that note, Claire, I'll turn it back to you to moderate some further questions.
Thank you so much to you both. I'm very happy to say that we already have some questions in the Q&A. I was thinking there might be a moment of awkwardness where I would have to fill, but we have questions, so let's get into it. All right, so the first question is...
Lisa, I've spilt the almond milk.
Oops. Firstly, thank you for your insights, for both of you. For two so remarkable and successful women is the comment, and the question is this: what are your thoughts about a female leadership quota enforced by law to get a gender balance in our leadership positions?
Well, I have always believed that mandatory quotas will end up having a perverse effect. I would much rather see targets and people being held to account for meeting those targets. I feel that if you mandate a quota, you'll end up with a perverse situation where a woman is being appointed not because she's the best, but because you had to at law. And I don't think it's fair to the woman. I don't think it's fair to the appointment. And I would be doing a lot more in the area of targets. We did this in Malcolm Turnbull's cabinet. We were faced with not enough female leaders in the, or appointments to the Commonwealth boards, and I think there are about 5,000 positions at the federal cabinet, 5,000 positions to agencies and boards and institutions and the like. And so we said we're going to have a target of 50% female. And what would happen is a minister would come forward with the names of the people to go on the National Library, and if they didn't have at least 50% of the nominees as female, they'd be told to go back and start again, come back with that number. And over time, it made a dramatic difference. People were held to account. If you haven't got 50% female nominees, why not? Go back and have a look. And the women are there, but it just takes more effort often to find their CV or convince them that, yes, they would be the right person for that job. Naomi, your thoughts? I have to clean up the almond milk.
Lisa. I think on targets and quotas, I think that there may well be certain instances where a quota, a short-dated quota, is the kind of thing that that should be or could be contemplated, partly because we just have such a long track record of not making material progress, and sort of critical mass is pretty important, I think, to women having the impact around a table. It's very hard. You did it, but it is very hard, I think, to be there on your own. in the end, the case I think is compelling. You make better decisions as an organisation for the organisation in the circumstances that it finds itself for the short term and the long term if you have a diversity of views. So it will become self-fulfilling, I think. But maybe some short-dated quotas are what's required. Personally, I also love targets, though. I think, you know, I know, for example, from a Wesfarmers standpoint, we have targets that, you know, really serve to motivate behaviour, and they're becoming sort of self-fulfilling, and they're targets that go from everything from sort of emissions to Aboriginal employment to gender balance. So,
but you've got to hold people to account for those targets. There's
correct.
no point in setting a target and saying, oh, well, we didn't meet that. There has to be rigorous accountability. And I'm on a number of advisory boards where when I first joined, I was either the first female on the board or one of very few. And if it's a matter you raise openly, others around the board table, they get it. They know they need diversity. They know they'll get better outcomes. But often it's that they actually don't know someone to a point. And some of these boards where you're invited on, women need to put other women's names forward. So that's something I'm often seeking to do, to find female leaders. I mean, how lucky were we to get Tanya Hosh as our newest council member. She's just been named, she's an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander woman. She's just been named as the South Australian of the Year, and she's on our council, and what a fantastic contribution she makes. But we deliberately set out to look for a young Indigenous woman to be on our council, and she's outstanding.
Back to you, Claire. Or Emily, if there are more questions.
Just in case Claire might be having some technical issues, I'll jump in and ask the next question, which is, what would you do when you're close to giving up everything, when it all just seems too hard?
I'd go home and have a good night's sleep, because the next day things tend to be in perspective. But find someone whose judgment you trust and talk it through with them. Whatever the issue is, don't give up until you've looked at all the alternatives and the options. And think about what it would be like if you weren't doing whatever it is that you're giving up. Does it mean that much to you, or can you give it up and go on and do something else? But I always find that it helps if you have a good night's sleep. I sound like my mother. A good night's sleep, and then have someone you trust to talk things through with. And if you feel very alone in this situation, think long and hard. There will be someone in your life that you can trust to discuss it with, and whose perspective you'll appreciate, and they'll put it in context for you. What do you think?
I think that's spot on. I mean, the most wicked and difficult of situations are best addressed by, collaborating, by working, whether it be a business problem or a personal situation, by finding that confidant that you can have a conversation with, by finding that person who could play, or who plays a sort of a mentoring kind of role, and who can give you the support to take that one next step. Not many things are your burden to bear alone. A burden shared is often halved.
Very wise.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. Claire, did you want to ask the next question?
Keep going, Emily, because I'm on the phone now, so I'll just be tapping and doing silly things. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so this one is quite an ANU specific question, but you may be able to perhaps answer more broadly in terms of advice for women. So the question is, as two very senior women at the ANU, what would be your advice on the best opportunities to pursue for early career academics aspiring for senior leadership positions like yours? So I suppose senior, more broad senior leadership positions rather than specifically academic ones. And this person has also said, thanks for your time and thoughts today. I've got a lot out of it. Julie is simply amazing.
Thank you. Well, alumna.
I mean, for me, I think you know, almost whatever the pursuit, professional or otherwise, it's always stood me, I think, in good stead to find the stuff that I love. You know, so I do what I do, whether it be serving on the ANU Council or the work that I do, and the stuff that I do outside of work, because I enjoy it. And really, you know, that for me, that allows you to bring your very best all the time, and be passionate and enthusiastic about it. But then I do quite deliberately do some of the things that Julie was talking about in terms of cultivating support, thinking about pathways. Probably not as actively as I should, but I try to have you know, some of the people around me there to provide advice, counsel, support, you know, and encouragement. So definitely that you know, it's a team.
I think that's right. I would also suggest that once you've worked out what you're passionate about, I mean, what is it that gets you up in the morning and gets you off into ANU? I mean, what excites you and what are you passionate about? Life's too short to be doing things that you hate. And then once you've identified that, take every opportunity that helps you achieve your goal. And that will mean taking risks, but have the courage to take risks. I mean, obviously not unnecessary risks, but think it through, think of the consequences, and then if the risk is worth taking, we'll do it. Get advice from others, but trust your own instincts and your own judgment on what it is that makes you happy and fulfilled and what gets you excited and challenged in life. I think that's some of the advice I'd certainly pass on anyway.
And just one quick, I completely agree about the kind of taking the opportunities that might come your way. I've worked at sort of a couple of, not many, one organisation for about 20 years and at Wesfarmers for the last 2.5 years. And I'm a big believer in being what I call a good corporate citizen. Now, you know, a good citizen of the organisation that you're attached to, and that often means doing things that are outside of that are not in your job description. So I was working in equity capital markets, but I led the government relations effort. I was not the government relations person for Deutsche Bank. I was always involved in the Pride Committee and the Women's Committee, and these are these kind of hallmarks of being, you know, what I call a good corporate citizen. You know, they've always paid good dividends to me, I think.
Well said.
Yeah. We're getting very close to time now, but I might just try and sneak in one more question, which is, have you made mistakes and how do you get past them?
Oh, yeah, I've made massive mistakes. We all do. We're all human. But I think the challenge is to not let your mistakes overwhelm you and to learn from them. I know it sounds cliched, but don't do it again. If you've made a mistake, understand what the mistake was, take responsibility for it and move on. Don't wallow in the mistake, fix it, obviously, but don't do it again. And I think that it's a simple enough lesson, but I try not to look back and have regrets about things. You can't rewrite history. You can't change what actually happened. So learn from it, draw a line, move on. I don't wallow in the mistakes I've made. You know, some of them make me cringe when I think about it now, but I'll put it down to naivety. But now I think, okay, made a mistake, own up to it, take responsibility for it. When I say own up to it, either to yourself or publicly if you have to, but move on, draw a line, move on, and don't dwell on it. Anything to add, Naomi?
No, I think that's very good advice, very, very sound advice. I think definitely, you know, don't beat yourself up over it. There's nothing you can do to change it. You did it, learn, move on.
Excellent, I like it. And I think we're probably at the point now where we're going to need to finish up. But what a fantastic session this has been for our first ever Women in Leadership webinar. The bar has been set extremely high, and it's been wonderful just hearing the conversation between the two of you, and it has been extremely conversational, which is part of what has been so terrific, and hearing about your personal experiences, I think, has been of great benefit to everybody. So thank you so much. And Claire, was there anything that you wanted to add?
I just wanted to add my thanks to you, Emily, for doing all the organising, and to Olivia too for helping us. It's always good to have a plan B, which I discovered when my internet dropped out. And thank you again. You're absolutely right about the warmth and the dynamic between Naomi and Julie. It gives, I think, us all great confidence in how, if we support each other, how we can do great things. So thank you again so much.
I think we're allowed to hug in Western Australia.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for attending today. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.